Hello, my beautiful friends. I am Laurel Bleadon-Maffei with Illuminating Souls, welcoming you to this episode of Sleepy Bedtime Blessings, a podcast to help you rest, relax, and hopefully fall asleep. I am an angelic practitioner, a spiritual teacher, and an encourager of souls. And I am here to help you connect more deeply with your angels and awaken to the magic in your soul. And even though I'm here to help you awaken to your magic, for now you have permission to rest and fall asleep. During my waking hours, I facilitate angel sessions, which help connect you with your angels, and I offer soul mentoring in a variety of classes. And you can learn more about this at my website, illuminating-souls.com. And you can also register for my daily inspiration email blast, where I will send you inspirational morsels each weekday. But for now, I am here to help you let go of the day and come into a beautiful sanctuary of sleep. Your angels are already here, and they have filled this broadcast with love for you. So take a nice deep breath in and cozy on up. As we get started in our conversation, it's still early in the new year, and I have been contemplating the pressure we sometimes feel to set our intentions. Somehow, the early part of the year seems to encourage us to set the bar pretty high. And I don't know about you, but that's not what I'm feeling right now. I am really being guided to be very gentle with myself. Perhaps you are too. We have been through a lot, and we are still going through a lot. So one of the things that I take tremendous comfort in is knowing that even when things feel still, or I feel still, that movement is always taking place. The ocean is never really still. There are all kinds of currents happening beneath the surface. And the same is true with multi-dimensional co-creation. I affirm that there is goodness in play for you right now. And I'm guided to share one of the morsels of inspiration that has become sort of a cornerstone of my life. And it's something I read on a greeting card when I was about 19 years old, so long time ago. And I purchased the card for a friend, and I wound up never sending it to them because I'd grown so attached to the message it contained. And it contained a quote that had been attributed to Emerson, but was actually not written by him at all. And it's the prose about success. It says, to laugh often and much, to win the respect of intelligent people and the affection of children, to earn the appreciation of honest critics and endure the betrayal of false friends, to appreciate the beauty, to find the best in others, to leave the world a bit better, whether by a healthy child, a garden patch, or a redeemed social condition. To know even one life has breathed easier because you have lived, this is to have succeeded. And the line that struck me, like deep in the center of my being, is the one that says to know that even one life has breathed easier because you have lived, this is to succeed. And I have come to live that as part of my purpose and my hope, my great hope. I remember at such a young age that the idea that even one person might breathe easier because I existed seemed like such a profound, sacred covenant. I couldn't imagine what I would ever do to earn such a blessing. And as I have grown into my role and my work, I turn to this often. You know, in the days of social media, and we count our numbers and how many people you have on a mailing list. I always remember that each person is the universe. So you, right now, listening, you are the whole world to me right now. And if this podcast is helping you breathe even a little bit easier tonight, it's all worth it, because you are precious and you are holy. And you are the reason I am here right now, whispering these words into the ethers, because your angels want you to know that you matter and you are everything. And I also invite you to give yourself permission to integrate this into part of your awareness of who you are, because lives breathe easier because you are here too. I know that this is true. So breathe in right now and know that your life makes a difference. Most of us will not live lives where we are famous and receive accolades. But most of us live lives where we ripple kindness and generosity of spirit into the world. Whether you do this by rescuing an animal, but the truth is, if you've ever rescued an animal, you know they've really rescued you, yes. There's a ripple of light and goodness that is taking place in the world because you are here. And we are so deeply grateful for you. So beautiful angels on high, I know you are already here. And I ask that you amplify the vibration of divine love in this message and in this broadcast. That each of the beloveds here receive the blessing of your love. That they remember that they are precious in all of this world. And angels, I also ask that you bring in waves of healing, that we need not even know what's up for healing, and we don't need to know because God knows, but that the beautiful healing light flows in and touches upon whatever is here to receive the light, and that this healing ripples across the timeline of our lives through all time and space. So, dear ones, just take a nice deep breath in and out. And allow yourself to receive the love and the healing light that is here for you right now. Your angels carry such deep, abiding love for you. They know the truth of you. They know the prayers in your heart. They know your challenges. They know the deepest parts of you. And they hold you with reverence and love. So breathe and allow yourself to receive the goodness that is flowing through for you. You are enough. You have done enough. And now it's your time to rest and replenish. And may your dreams be sweet. And may your heart connect with sparks of inspiration and light. So when you awaken in the morning, you awaken with a greater lightness of spirit. So you snuggle on in and bathe and the love of your angels and of God. And now I'm going to read to you for a little while. So tonight we're going to return to Anne of Green Gables. I actually had not been planning on returning to this book so quickly. I just read it a few weeks ago for you. But the truth is, I have fallen in love with this book, and I love the language of it and the rhythm of the story. And I found as I was contemplating what I would read to you in this episode, I kept feeling like we had to go back and visit with Anne again. And you know what's interesting is this is the first time I'm reading this book. It was not a book that found me in my childhood. And I didn't actually become acquainted with it until I watched the Netflix series Anne with an E. And so as I was contemplating this podcast, this was one of the books I put on the list. And as I read it to you, I can feel the energy of it, and I love it. It's a remarkable thing to read out loud. I don't know when the last time was that you read out loud, but there's something about hearing each word form and lead into the next word that's really remarkable. So you don't have to go back and listen to the other episodes. You know, you're really not meant to be awake by this time anyways. If you are, I'm glad you're here. And so, as I read these books to you, it's not really important you stay up to date with the plot. It's not like a book on tape where they don't even call them books on tape anymore. I just showed that I'm of the Fred Flintstone era. They're called audiobooks. Audiobooks, you're efforting, you're trying to stay awake and aware to the plot, and right now it's just okay if you drift off. You can always go back and read the book when you're awake another time. But here's what's happening. So Marilla and Matthew Cuthbert are brother and sister. We know that Matthew's about 60 years old, and they live in Avonlea, which is in Canada, and they're getting older. They have a farm, and they need some help on the farm, so they're inspired to adopt a little boy from the orphanage. So they'll give him a good upbringing, and he can learn to help take care of the farm. So Matthew, who's painfully shy, takes the horse and wagon to the train station to pick up the orphan boy that had been left for them. Only it's not a boy, it's a little girl, and it's Anne. And Anne is a force of nature. She has a vivid imagination and an exuberance for life and a positive outlook, even though she's been through so much. She's skinny and has bright red hair and talks a mile a minute. And so Matthew, not knowing what else to do, takes her home to Green Gables in hopes that Marilla, who's the stronger of the two of them, will be able to break it to Anne that she is actually not being adopted by them. So we pick up the story the next morning when Anne has shared how disappointed she is that she's not being adopted, but has now decided that she doesn't really want to get to know the farm because what's the point of falling in love when she'll have to leave it anyways? And Marilla can feel and sense that Matthew really wants to keep Anne. He's like, we could give her a good home. And she's enchanting, and let's not send her back. But Marilla is conflicted. She's like, this is not the child we agreed to adopt. And so this is where we pick up the story. And I'm going to read a paragraph that was in the last installment, but this will kind of help us get going. I never in all my life say or heard anything equal to her, muttered Marilla, beating a retreat down to the cellar after potatoes. She is kind of interesting, as Matthew says. I can feel already that I'm wondering what on earth she'll say next. She'll be casting a spell over me, too. She's cast it over Matthew. That look he gave me when he went out and said everything he said or hinted last night over again. I wish he was like other men and would talk things out. A body could answer back then and argue him into reason. But what's to be done with a man who just looks? Anne had relapsed into reverie with her chin in her hands and her eyes in the sky when Marilla returned from her cellar pilgrimage. There Marilla left her until the early dinner was on the table. I suppose I can have the mare and buggy this afternoon, Matthew, said Marilla. Matthew nodded and looked wistfully at Anne. Marilla intercepted the look and said grimly, I'm going to drive over to White Sands and settle this thing. I'll take Anne with me, and Mrs. Spencer will probably make arrangements to send her back to Nova Scotia at once. I'll set your tea out for you, and I'll be home in time to milk the cows. Still Matthew said nothing, and Marilla had a sense of having wasted words and breath. There is nothing more aggravating than a man who won't talk back, unless it is a woman who won't. Matthew hitched the sorrel into the buggy in due time, and Marilla and Anne set off. Matthew opened the yard gate for them, and as they drove slowly through, he said to nobody in particular as it seemed, Little Jerry Boat from the creek was here this morning, and I told him I guess I would hire him for the summer. Marilla made no reply, but she hit the unlucky sorrel such a vicious clip with the whip that the fat mare, unused to such treatment, whizzed indignantly down the lane at an alarming pace. Marilla looked back once as the buggy bounced along and saw that aggravating Matthew leaning over the gate, looking wistfully after them. Chapter 5, Anne's History. Do you know, said Anne confidentially, I have made up my mind to enjoy this drive. It's been my experience that you can nearly always enjoy things if you make up your mind firmly that you will. Of course, you must make it up firmly. I'm not going to think about going back to the asylum while we're having our drive. I'm just going to think about the drive. Oh, look, there's one little early wild rose out. Isn't it lovely? Don't you think it must be glad to be a rose? Wouldn't it be nice if roses could talk? I'm sure they could tell us such lovely things. And isn't pink the most bewitching color in the world? I love it, but I can't wear it. Red-headed people can't wear pink, not even in imagination. Did you ever know of anybody whose hair was red when she was young, but got to be another color when she grew up? No, I don't know as they ever did, said Marilla mercilessly, and I shouldn't think it likely to happen in your case either. Anne sighed. Well, that's another hope gone. My life is a perfect graveyard of buried hopes. That's a sentence I read in a book once, and I say it over to comfort myself whenever I'm disappointed in anything. I don't see where the comforting comes in myself, said Marilla. Why, because it sounds so nice and romantic, just as if I were a heroine in a book, you know. I'm so fond of romantic things, and a graveyard full of buried hopes is about as romantic a thing as one can imagine, isn't it? I'm rather glad I have one. Are we going across the Lake of Shining Waters today? We're not going over Barry's Pond, if that's what you mean by your Lake of Shining Waters. We're going by the shore road. Well, shore road sounds nice, said Anne dreamily. Is it as nice as it sounds? Just when you said shore road, I saw it in a picture in my mind as quick as that. And White Sands is a pretty name too, but I don't like it as well as Avonlea. Avonlea is a lovely name. It just sounds like music. How far is it to White Sands? It's 5 miles, and as you're evidently bent on talking, you might as well talk to some purpose by telling me what you know about yourself. Oh, what I know about myself isn't really worth telling, said Anne eagerly. If you'll only let me tell you what I imagine about myself, you'll think of it ever so much more interesting. No, I don't want any of your imaginings. Just stick to bald facts. Begin at the beginning. Where were you born and how old are you? I was 11 last March, said Anne, resigning herself to bald facts with a little sigh. And I was born in Bolingbroke, Nova Scotia. My father's name was Walter Shirley, and he was a teacher in the Bolingbroke High School. My mother's name was Bertha Shirley. Aren't Walter and Bertha lovely names? I'm so glad my parents had nice names. It would be a real disgrace to have a father named, well, say Jedediah would. I guess it doesn't matter what a person's name is as long as he behaves himself, said Marilla. Well, I don't know. Anne looked thoughtful. I read in a book once that a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, but I've never been able to believe it. I don't believe a rose would be as nice if it were called a thistle or a skunk cabbage. I suppose my father would have been a good man even if he had been called Jedediah, but I'm sure it would have been a cross. Well, my mother was a teacher in the high school too, but when she married my father, she gave up teaching, of course. A husband was enough responsibility. Mrs. Thomas said that they were a pair of babies and as poor as church mice. They went to live in a weeny-teeny little yellow house in Bolingbroke. I've never seen that house, but I've imagined it thousands of times. I think it must have had honeysuckle over the parlor window and lilacs in the front yard and lilies of the valley just inside the gate. Yes, and muslin curtains in all the windows. Muslin curtains give a house such an air. I was born in that house. Mrs. Thomas said that I was the homeliest baby she ever saw. I was so scrawny and tiny and nothing but eyes, but that mother thought I was perfectly beautiful. I should think a mother would be a better judge than a poor woman who came in to scrub, wouldn't you? I'm glad she was satisfied with me anyhow. I would feel so sad if I thought I was a disappointment to her, because she didn't live very long after that, you see. She died of fever when I was just 3 months old. I do wish she'd lived long enough for me to remember calling her mother. I think it would be so sweet to say mother, don't you? and Father died 4 days afterwards from fever too. That left me an orphan, and folks were at their wits' end. So Mrs. Thomas said what to do with me. You see, nobody wanted me even then. It seems to be my fate. Father and mother had both come from places far away, and it was well known they hadn't any relatives living. Finally, Mrs. Thomas said she'd take me, though she was poor and had a drunken husband. She brought me up by hand. Do you know if there's anything in being brought up by hand that ought to make people who are brought up that way better than other people? Because whenever I was naughty, Mrs. Thomas would ask me how I could be such a bad girl when she had brought me up by hand, reproachful like. Mr. and Mrs. Thomas moved away from Bolingbroke to Marysville, and I lived with them until I was 8 years old. I helped look after the Thomas children. There were 4 of them, younger than me, and I can tell you that they took a lot of looking after. Then Mr. Thomas was killed falling under a train, and his mother offered to take Mrs. Thomas and the children, but she didn't want me. Mrs. Thomas was at her wit's end, so she said what to do with me. Then Mrs. Hammond, from up the river, came down and said she'd take me, seeing as I was handy with children. And I went up the river to live with her in a little clearing among the stumps. It was a very lonesome place. I'm sure I never could have lived there if I hadn't had an imagination. Mr. Hammond worked on a little sawmill up there, and Mrs. Hammond had 8 children. She had twins 3 times. I like babies in moderation, but twins 3 times in succession is too much. I told Mrs. Hammond so firmly when the last pair came. I used to get so dreadfully tired carrying them about. I lived upriver with Mrs. Hammond over 2 years, and then Mr. Hammond died, and Mrs. Hammond broke up housekeeping. She divided her children among her relatives and went to the States. I had to go to the asylum at Hopeton because nobody would take me. They didn't want me at the asylum either. They said they were overcrowded as it was, but they had to take me, and I was there 4 months until Mrs. Spencer came. Anne finished up with another sigh of relief this time. Evidently, she did not like talking about her experiences in a world that had not wanted her. "Did you ever go to school?" demanded Marilla, turning the sorrel mare down the shore road. "Not a great deal. I went a little the last year I stayed with Mrs. Thomas. When I went upriver, we were so far from school that I couldn't walk it in winter, and there was a vacation in summer, so I could only go in the spring and fall. But of course I went while I was at the asylum. I can read pretty well, and I know ever so many pieces of poetry by heart. Don't you just love poetry that gives you crinkly feelings up and down your back? There is a piece in the 5th Reader, The Downfall of Poland, that is just full of thrills. Of course, I wasn't in the 5th Reader. I was only in the 4th, but the big girls used to lend me theirs to read." "Were those women, Mrs. Thomas and Mrs. Hammond, good to you?" asked Marilla, looking at Anne out of the corner of her eye. "Oh," faltered Anne. Her sensitive little face suddenly flushed scarlet, and embarrassment sat on her brow. "Oh, they meant to be. I know they meant to be just as good and kind as possible. And when people mean to be good to you, you don't always mind very much when they're not quite, always. They had a good deal to worry them, you know. It's very trying to have a drunken husband, you see, And it must be very trying to have twins 3 times in succession, don't you think? But I feel sure they meant to be good to me. Marilla asked no more questions. Anne gave herself up to a silent rapture over the shore road, and Marilla guided the sorrel abstractedly while she pondered deeply. Pity was suddenly stirring in her heart for the child. What a starved, unloved life she had, a life of drudgery and poverty and neglect. For Marilla was shrewd enough to read between the lines of Anne's history and divine the truth. No wonder she had been so delighted at the prospect of a real home. It was a pity she had to be sent back. What if she, Marilla, should indulge Matthew's unaccountable whim and let her stay? He was set on it, and the child seemed a nice, teachable little thing. She's got too much to say, thought Marilla, but she might be trained out of that, and there's nothing rude or slangy in what she says. She's ladylike. It's likely her people were nice folks. The shore road was woodsy and wild and lonesome. On the right hand, scrub firs, their spirits quite unbroken by long years of tussle with the gulf winds, grew thickly. On the left were the steep red sandstone cliffs, so near the track in places that a mare of less steadiness than the sorrel might have tried the nerves of the people behind her. Down at the base of the cliffs were heaps of surf-worn rocks or little sandy coves inlaid with pebbles as with ocean jewels. Beyond laid the sea, shimmering and blue, and over it soared the gulls, their pinions flashing silvery in the sunlight. "Isn't the sea wonderful?" said Anne, rousing from a long, wide-eyed silence. "Once, when I lived in Marysville, Mr. Thomas hired an express wagon and took us all to spend the day at the shore 10 miles away. I enjoyed every moment of that day, even if I had to look after the children all the time. I lived it over in happy dreams for years. But this shore is nicer than the Marysville shore. Aren't those gulls splendid? Would you like to be a gull?" "I think I would, that is, if I couldn't be a human girl. Don't you think it would be nice to wake up at sunrise and swoop down over the water and away over that lovely blue all day, and then at night to fly back to one's nest? Oh, I can just imagine myself doing it. What big house is that ahead, please?" "That's the White Sands Hotel. Mr. Kirk runs it, but the season hasn't begun yet. There are heaps of Americans come there for the summer. They think the shore is just about right." "I was afraid it might be Mrs. Spencer's place," said Anne mournfully. "I don't want to get there. Somehow it will seem like the end of everything." Chapter 6. Marilla Makes Up Her Mind. Get there they did, however, in due season. Mrs. Spencer lived in a big yellow house at White Sands Cove, and she came to the door with surprise and welcome mingled on her benevolent face. "Dear, dear," she exclaimed, "you are the last folks I was looking for today, but I'm real glad to see you. You'll put your horse in. And how are you, Anne?" "I'm as well as can be expected, thank you," said Anne smilelessly. A blight seemed to have descended on her. "I suppose we'll stay a little while to rest the mare," said Marilla, "but I promised Matthew I'd be home early. The fact is, Mrs. Spencer, there's been a queer mistake somewhere, and I've come over to see where it is." We sent word, Matthew and I, for you to bring us a boy from the asylum. We told your brother Robert to tell you we wanted a boy 10 or 11 years old." "Marilla Cuthbert, you don't say so," said Mrs. Spencer in distress. "Why, Robert sent word down by his daughter Nancy and said you wanted a girl, didn't she, Flora Jane?" appealing to her daughter, who had come out to the steps. "She certainly did, Miss Cuthbert," corroborated Flora Jane earnestly. "I'm dreadful sorry," said Mrs. Spencer. "It's too bad, but it certainly wasn't my fault, you see, Miss Cuthbert. I did the best I could, and I thought I was following your instructions. Nancy is a terrible flighty thing. I've often had to scold her well for her heedlessness." "It was our own fault," said Marilla resignedly. "We should have come to you ourselves and not left an important message to be passed along by word of mouth in that fashion. Anyhow, the mistake has been made, and the only thing to do is to set it right. Can we send the child back to the asylum? I suppose they'll take her back, won't they?" "I suppose so," said Mrs. Spencer thoughtfully, "but I don't think it will be necessary to send her back. Mrs. Peter Blewett was up here yesterday, and she was saying to me how much she wished she'd sent me for a little girl to help her. Mrs. Peter has a large family, you know, and she finds it hard to get help. Anne will be the very girl for you. I call it positively providential." Marilla did not look as if she thought Providence had much to do with the matter. Here was an unexpectedly good chance to get this unwelcome orphan off her hands, and she did not even feel grateful for it. She knew Mrs. Peter Blewett only by sight as a small, shrewish-faced woman without an ounce of superfluous flesh on her bones. But she had heard of her, a terrible worker and driver Mrs. Peter was said to be, and discharged servants' girls told fearsome tales of her temper and stinginess, and her family of pert, quarrelsome children. Marilla felt a qualm of conscience at the thought of handing Anne over to her tender mercies. "Well, I'll go in, and we'll talk the matter over," she said. "And if there isn't Mrs. Peter coming up the lane this blessed minute," exclaimed Mrs. Spencer, bustling her guests through the hall into the parlor, where a deadly chill struck on them as if the air had been strained so long through dark green, closely drawn blinds that it had lost every particle of warmth it had ever possessed. "That is real lucky, for we can settle the matter right away. Take the armchair, Miss Cuthbert. Anne, you sit here on the ottoman and don't wiggle. Let me have your hats. Flora Jane, go out and put the kettle on. Good afternoon, Mrs. Blewett. We were just saying how fortunate it was you happened along. Let me introduce you to two ladies, Mrs. Blewett, Miss Cuthbert. Please excuse me for just a moment. I forgot to tell Flora Jane to take the buns out of the oven." Mrs. Spencer whisked away after pulling up the blinds. Anne, sitting mutely on the ottoman, with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, stared at Mrs. Blewett as one fascinated. Was she to be given into the keeping of this sharp-faced, sharp-eyed woman? She felt a lump coming up in her throat, and her eyes smarted painfully. She was beginning to be afraid she couldn't keep the tears back when Mrs. Spencer returned, flushed and beaming, quite capable of taking any and every difficulty, physical, mental, or spiritual, into consideration and settling it out of hand. "It seems there has been a mistake about this little girl, Mrs. Blewett," she said. I was under the impression that Mr. and Miss Cuthbert wanted a little girl to adopt. I was certainly told so, but it seems it was a boy they wanted. So if you're still of the same mind you were yesterday, I think she'll be just the thing for you. Mrs. Blewett darted her eyes over Anne from head to foot. How old are you, and what's your name? She demanded. Anne Shirley, faltered the shrinking child, not daring to make any stipulations regarding the spelling thereof. And I'm 11 years old. You don't look as if there was that much to you, but you are wiry. I don't know, but the wiry ones are the best after all. Well, if I take you, you'll have to be a good girl, you know, good and smart and respectful. I'll expect you to earn your keep, and no mistake about that. Yes, I suppose I might as well take her off your hands, Miss Cuthbert. The baby's awful fractious, and I'm clean worn out attending to him. If you like, I can take her home right now. Marilla looked at Anne and softened at sight of the child's pale face with a look of mute misery, the misery of a helpless little creature who finds itself once more caught in the trap from which it had escaped. Marilla felt an uncomfortable conviction that if she denied the appeal of that look, it would haunt her to her dying day. Moreover, she did not fancy Mrs. Blewett. To hand a sensitive, high-strung child over to such a woman, no, she could not take the responsibility of doing that. Well, I don't know, she said slowly. I didn't say that Matthew and I had absolutely decided that we wouldn't keep her. In fact, I may say Matthew is disposed to keep her. I just came over to find out how the mistake had occurred. I think I'd better take her home again and talk it over with Matthew. I feel that I oughtn't to decide on anything without consulting him. If we make up our mind not to keep her, we'll bring or send her over to you tomorrow night. If we don't, you may know that she is going to stay with us. Will that suit you, Mrs. Blewett? I suppose it'll have to, said Mrs. Blewett ungraciously. During Marilla's speech, a surprise had been dawning on Anne's face. First, the look of despair faded out. Then came a faint flush of hope. Her eyes grew deep and bright as morning stars. The child was quite transfigured, and a moment later, when Mrs. Spencer and Mrs. Blewett went out in quest of a recipe the latter had come to borrow, she sprang up and flew across the room to Marilla. Oh, Miss Cuthbert, did you really say that perhaps you would let me stay at Green Gables? She said in a breathless whisper, as if speaking aloud might shatter the glorious possibility. Did you really say it, or did I only imagine that you did? I think you'd better learn to control that imagination of yours, Anne, and if you can't distinguish between what is real and what isn't, said Marilla crossly. Yes, you did hear me say just that and no more. It isn't decided yet, and perhaps we will conclude to let Mrs. Blewett take you after all. She certainly needs you much more than I do. I'd rather go back to the asylum than go to live with her, said Anne passionately. She looks exactly like a gimlet. Marilla smothered a smile under the conviction that Anne must be reproved for such a speech. A little girl like you should be ashamed of talking so about a lady and a stranger, she said severely. Go back and sit down quietly and hold your tongue and behave as a good girl should. I'll try to do and be anything you want me if only you'll keep me, said Anne, returning meekly to her ottoman. When they arrived back at Green Gables that evening, Matthew met them in the lane. Marilla from afar had noted him prowling along it and guessed his motive. She was preparing for the relief she read in his face when he saw that she had at least brought back Anne with her. But she said nothing to him relative to the affair until they were both out in the yard behind the milking cows. Then she briefly told him Anne's history and the result of the interview with Mrs. Spencer. I wouldn't give a dog I liked to that Blewett woman, said Matthew with unusual vim. I don't fancy her style myself, admitted Marilla. But it's that or keeping her ourselves, Matthew. And since you seem to want her, I suppose I'm willing, or have to be. I've been thinking over the idea until I've gotten kind of used to it. It seems a sort of duty. I never brought up a child, especially a girl, and I dare say I'll make a terrible mess of it. But I'll do my best. So as far as I'm concerned, Matthew, she may stay. Matthew's shy face was a glow of delight. Well now, I reckoned you'd come to see it in that light, Marilla, he said. She is such an interesting little thing. It'd be more to the point if you could say she was a useful little thing, retorted Marilla. But I'll make it my business to see she's trained to be that. And mind, Matthew, you're not to go interfering with my methods. Perhaps an old maid doesn't know much about bringing up a child, but I guess she knows more than an old bachelor. So you just leave me to manage her. When I fail, it'll be time enough to put your oar in. There, Marilla. You can have your own way, said Matthew reassuringly. Only be as good and kind to her as you can without spoiling her. I kind of think she's one of the sort you can do anything with if only you get her to love you. Marilla sniffled to express her contempt for Matthew's opinions concerning anything feminine and walked off to the dairy with the pails. I won't tell her tonight that she can stay, she reflected as she strained the milk into the creamers. She'd be so excited that she wouldn't sleep a wink. Marilla Cuthbert, you're fairly in for it. Did you ever suppose you'd see the day when you'd be adopting an orphan girl? It's surprising enough, but not so surprising as that Matthew should be at the bottom of it, him that always seemed to have such a mortal dread of little girls. Anyhow, we've decided on the experiment, and goodness only knows what will come of it. And so we end this installment of Anne of Green Gables, knowing that Anne has secured her place with the Cuthberts and Green Gables. So thank you for letting me share this part of the story with you. And the angels and I are wishing you sweet dreams and a good night's sleep. Know that you are loved, that you are precious in all the world, and I am so grateful for the gift of you. Be well and blessings to you.